So I want to talk about one of my favorite books today, just because I want to, and it's Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and it was one of those books that just, I read after college, alone, living in Manhattan, very lonely, and just blew me away. Just really changed my life, and I actually thought I was going to write my dissertation on Kierkegaard and on what it meant to live the ironic life, and then I stumbled on Deleuze and Guattari, and that all went away. But Fear and Trembling, I have this copy now, although this was not the copy I read. I read The Penguin, which I think is actually a translation I prefer. But it actually came up in this sort of funny way where I was having my son's a little dyslexic. We were practicing some reading, and I grabbed Fear and Trembling off the table because it was lying there, and he opened it up, and it turns out he can read pretty well. But we ended up talking a lot about the book, and I forgot just how fantastic it is. One of the things that's really great about Kierkegaard and about this book is the way he frames everything. So I don't know if people are aware of this, but Kierkegaard very rarely wrote in his own name. He wasn't like the author putting forth ideas the way, let's say, every philosopher you can pretty much imagine, other than, let's say, Socrates. Right? Plato and Socrates have a very complicated relationship, right? Socrates is a character of Plato's, but Nietzsche, Hegel, Kant, Descartes, there are these thinkers who then write in their own name to express their ideas. That's not what Kierkegaard did. Kierkegaard has a whole series of pseudonyms. He writes under all these different names, and it's always from a perspective. Right? That's what makes talking about Kierkegaard or ascribing a quote to Kierkegaard kind of complicated, because one of my favorite quotes from a Kierkegaard book is from Either Or. But Either Or is 2 volumes. The first volume is a whole series of essays and diary entries and notes written by an aesthete. And the second volume is a whole bunch of letters written by a judge to that young man, to the man who wrote volume 1. But one of the quotes in volume 1 is from the aesthete's perspective, though. It's not from Kierkegaard, is if you get married or you don't get married, either way, you regret it. And I love that line. And I've used it and paraphrased it throughout my pedagogy, throughout my thinking, throughout my social encounters. But Kierkegaard per se didn't say that, right? It's a character in his body who writes that, right? So he's always deploying a fiction and a perspective, right? On the world. So again, volume 1 of Either Or is written from the perspective of an aesthete, volume 2 from the perspective of an ethicist, a judge. And then we get to read it, and we see this exchange between the aesthetic and the ethical, and fundamentally through this rubric of the Either Or, the sort of incommensurability of these two positions. In Fear and Trembling, the author is Johannes de Silencio, Johannes of Silence, or Silent John. And in the preface, it goes some great lengths to say, I'm not a philosopher. And he, as Kierkegaard is wont to do, he's always poking fun with his deep, dry irony. He is hilarious, Kierkegaard. I know in popular culture, Kierkegaard is represented as a sort of melancholy figure. No doubt in life, he no doubt was. But in his writing, he's hilariously funny, deeply ironic. And in fact, his dissertation, his first book, is called The Concept of Irony, and it goes through all his work and allows him to speak in these multiple registers at once. But in Fear and Trembling, he sort of opens up, and he pokes fun, as he again does often, at Hegel and the Hegelian system, and how he doesn't quite, how this will never fit into the system. But that was really Kierkegaard's point. Right, that he's coming up under Hegel, and the Hegelian system was all about accounting for everything. Right, it was sort of the sort of hubris of Hegel's great philosophical imagination, was that everything can be accounted for within his system. Kierkegaard wants a moment of difference, a moment of radical difference that cannot be subsumed within the system. Right, if everything for Hegel is dialectical, that every position suggests its own opposite and yields something else, that there's this constant process. Kierkegaard wanted an insistent moment that would in fact not be taken up dialectically, that in fact would insist on itself and stand outside the system as a kind of rupture to that system, a way just a kind of refusal, almost like metabolic refusal, right, causing kind of indigestion for the Hegelian metabolism. And for Kierkegaard, this comes down to the individual. Individual human being is a moment of radical difference. And that will provide him a kind of a way again to disrupt the Hegelian system, but also something that works sort of against the rise of a sort of nation state. And you see the same thing in Nietzsche with the sort of rise of modernism in the community. And Kierkegaard finds this sort of movement, what he calls the present age. He has a short book where he's critiquing a book, and it's called The Present Age, and this sort of what he calls the leveling of culture, in which everything becomes equal. But for him, the individual isn't equal. Right? Isn't equal to anything else, not because he's better or worse. It's not an Ubermensch. It's simply a site of difference, a site of radical particularity. Fear and Trembling, he sets up this sort of rubric, this fiction. And again, because it's a fiction as opposed to strictly the proffering of a philosophy, it allows him this sort of contemplative mode, this mode of reckoning outside of all the jargon of philosophy, of laying down a system. And so this character, Johannes de Silentio, takes up the story of Abraham and Isaac. And that's what Fear and Trembling, all Fear and Trembling is. All Fear and Trembling is an interpretation, a reading of the story of Abraham and Isaac. For those of you who don't know, I'm not that versed in biblical studies, but I do know the story of Abraham and Isaac. But for people who don't, Abraham is really the first, not really, he is the first Jew. He's the first one who makes a deal with God. God really likes Abraham. And one of the weirder aspects of the Torah, which some people call the Old Testament, but to Jews there is no Old Testament, right? Because there's no New Testament. there's the Torah. Is that God likes hanging out. So God's hanging out with Abraham. And there's all these scenes with God, and God has some people hanging around with him who like to spend time with Abraham. And, God ends up making a deal with Abraham and says, dig me and I'll dig you, and I'll dig your spawn, and I'll be your God. And Abraham is married to Sarah. And they couldn't have kids. Sarah, one of them was barren. It was unclear, right? They couldn't have kids. And they're very old. They're 100 years old or older. And God says, listen, I'm going to give you a child. And Sarah laughs. God turns. It's a great scene in the Torah. God turns. He's like, you're laughing, man? I'm God. It's great. Abraham and God's relationship is fantastic. It comes up again in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God tells Abraham, "Listen, I'm gonna wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, come on, the place has gone to shit. It's time for that place to go." And Abraham's like, "Really?" And he's so nervous talking to God. He's talking to God. He's like, "Really? You're gonna destroy the whole place? What if there are 100 good people?" God's like, "Okay, if there's 100, I won't do it." He's like, "What if there are 50 good people?" And each time, Abraham's, negotiating with God. I mean, imagine that, right? That's, again, such a beautiful moment in the Torah. Abraham negotiating with God, and he's nervous and whatever. So God and Abraham are hanging out, and God's like, I'm going to give you a child, and that child is Isaac. And it's this miracle, right? Because Sarah's like, not only couldn't they have children, Sarah's like 100 and something years old, but sure enough, they have a kid. And no one has loved a child as much as Abraham loves Isaac, right? I mean, he never thought he'd have a child. Here he has this child, and he's so in love. He's smitten with this child. And then at some point, God comes back to Abraham, as he likes to hang out with him, and says, "Listen, you got to go sacrifice Isaac. You got to take your son. You got to take him up the mountain, and you got to sacrifice him. You got to slit his throat." And Abraham agrees. Abraham goes to do it, right? And Abraham stays with his son, Isaac, who he loves more than anything, knowing that when he gets to the top of Mount Moriah, he is going to cut his son's throat. And they walk for days, and they walk up this mountain. And he has Isaac drop to his knees, and Abraham takes his knife to pull across his only son's throat, and God says, well, no need to do it. You're done good. The deal's done. And then Abraham and Isaac return home, and life goes on. Crazy freaking story, right? Crazy freaking story. And Kierkegaard, in his character in this book, who's the pseudonym Johannes de Silencio, can't fathom this. Can't fathom how crazy the story is. And the whole book is him trying to picture Abraham walking with Isaac, those days to the mountain. And then the return. What happens upon his return? What does that look like? And what Kierkegaard, or with Fear and Trembling, comes down to, he says, okay, well, we're really stuck with a kind of either or, because either Abraham is a madman, right? Either he's a madman and a would-be murderer, right? Breaking the laws of his community, breaking the ethical laws, social laws, just a straight-out madman. Or something else is happening. And Kierkegaard in this book is going to call this other thing that he thinks is happening faith. Right? So he says either Abraham is a would-be murderer, a madman, and the ethic, the community needs to come down on him and jail him, and he has to pay the consequences. Or Abraham is the father of faith, right? That there's a new category, and that faith is a direct relationship, what Kierkegaard would call the teleological suspension of the ethical, meaning all the mores, all the rules of every day that guide you through the social, what it means to be a person, what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a husband or wife, all that is suspended. And the individual stands one-to-one before the infinity of God and has a direct relationship to the infinity of God. And that relationship, again, exceeds, I guess exceeds is the word, exceeds the social, exceeds the ethical. It operates according to a different logic. So again, if you go back to either or that I was talking about, right? Volume 1 gives us the aesthetic position, which is an immediate relationship to the stuff of this world, to sex and desire and music. And there's a great essay in there on Mozart's Don Giovanni and on Don Juan character in general, and this kind of a consumptive character, this immediate relationship. Kierkegaard loves the immediacy of the aesthetic relationship to life, the consumptive, the one who delectates, right, with his cocktail and his, enjoys the things of this world. And then there's what Kierkegaard calls the ethical, which is the social, which has all these rules, and what it means to live within your social identities, within communities. But then for Kierkegaard, there's two phases after the ethical, right? So you have the aesthetic, which is immediate relationship to life, to the senses. You have the ethical, in which your relationship to life is mediated by rules, right? You only have some things, not other things. You don't have sex with lots of women because that's not what you do, or there's social laws that mediate your relationship to immediate experience. But then Kierkegaard says, well, there's a suspension of the ethical, and there's a new immediate relationship you can have, not to your senses, but to the infinite. And he calls this the religious phase. And the religious phase for Kierkegaard itself has two phases, right? The first step he calls infinite resignation. And that's the person who wants this direct relationship to the infinite all the time. And so devotes their life to it. And those are the monks and the priests, the people who leave the social. And let's say they go live in a monastery. And maybe they take a vow of silence. Maybe they definitely take a vow of chastity. And they want to sort of rid themselves both of the immediacy of the aesthetic. They want to rid themselves of the mediation of the social, the human, all too human. And they want to just bathe in the infinite glory of God all the time, all day. And Kierkegaard, when he writes about these people, seems to have a bit of a disdain, almost like it's easy. What he calls these nights of infinite resignation. They just resign themselves infinitely to the infinite. Because there's another stage that Kierkegaard is going to privilege, and that is the stage he finds in Abraham, and that is what he calls the night of faith. And this is the person who takes leave of the ethical, takes leave of social mores, just like Abraham does. He says, I'm a father, but I'm not going to act as a father. I'm going to go kill my son. I'm going to break all the laws of my community, right? All those things don't matter anymore, right? They've been suspended. And he's going to have this direct relationship to the infinite, to God. And he goes up the mountain and he's ready to take leave. But then he does this other thing. He comes back. He comes back. He comes back. He leads his life. Imagine coming back after that incident and just crawling into bed with your wife. He just crawls in with Sarah. What does he say to her? Does he say anything? Does he say anything to anyone? What could you say? And what could Sarah possibly say? She'd be like, Jesus Christ, you're a nut job, right? So Kierkegaard is wrestling this, and this is what Fear and Trembling is. It's his attempt to imagine what's going on in Abraham's life. What's driving him? What are these motivations? What happens when he gets back? And for Kierkegaard, this is this next step. And Abraham does not come in and confess and say, go and kill me. He goes about his life. He's a good husband. He's a good citizen. And this is what Kierkegaard will call the night of faith. The night of faith is the one who, with every step they take, walks into the infinite and back to the finite. Into the infinite and back to the finite. You walk with God and you walk with the social simultaneously. And yet the two never become one. They are radically incongruous. The ethical and the infinite, the religious, they cannot meet. They deny each other. We know that because Abraham had to kill his son. That has no place in the ethical except as murder. In the religious, it is this other thing. And so for Kierkegaard, the night of faith is Abraham walking up that mountain with his son, whipping out that knife, being told to stop, and then coming back down the mountain and into the social, and then going about his life. And Kierkegaard will say that's the night of faith. The night of faith is incognito. He doesn't bear his religiosity all over the place. He has no need to. He's silent in his faith precisely because to articulate it in the social will end him in jail, put him in jail. Right? The things he believes, and this is one of the great moments of Kierkegaard, great moments. He says, faith is not premised on proof. It's not premised on the ethical. It's not premised on evidence. You have faith on what Kierkegaard calls the strength of the absurd. It's absurd. It's absurd that you should go kill your son. And then even more absurd is that you get your son back, right? You get your son back twofold because you were willing to kill him, but now I have him again. I have him again, right? And it's that double movement that blows Kierkegaard away. And in Fear and Trembling, he's not so sure. Neither Johannes de Silencio, the pseudonym, nor Kierkegaard are necessarily down with Abraham, right? They're like, they find it unfathomable. They're like, what is this? And yet they still come to this conclusion, which says either Abraham is a murderer or there's something else happening. He's either a murderer or the father of faith. There is nothing else. That is what the Abraham and Isaac story is. It's the setting up of these terms, of the suspension of the social mores, of the laws, of the ethical, of the way your identity is forged discursively, not just legally, right? And how that is, again, suspended. So you can have this direct relationship to the infinite, not because it's good and right, but because it's absurd, because it just is, because it speaks to a radical particularity of your relationship to the infinite. It can't be justified. It can't be explained. It is. So Kierkegaard's like, well, does this mean everyone should go walk their kid up and try to kill him up on the mountain? Of course not. That was for Abraham. That was Abraham's shtick with God. But it does suggest that we all have this calling to a direct relationship to the infinite vis-a-vis our individuality, which bypasses or supplants or exceeds all the ethical, right? It's where shit gets weird, man. Shit gets weird. And in this space of your own radical particularity, reckoning infinite becoming, despite and all social mores, is precisely where this new kind of living happens, right? And again, you can just surrender to it, like, oh, I just want to live with God all the time. Or you can do the next thing. Take this even stranger step and say, I'm going to live with God all the time, and I'm going to live in the social. And I'm going to live in the social. That is the night of faith. That is the story of Abraham and Isaac, according to Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling. I can't recommend this book enough. It is just so funny and smart, and the way it goes about thinking through things, using this combination of fiction and thought experiments and different scenarios and logical reasoning and all of these things. And then comes to this absolutely exquisite position in which the call of the night of faith is to be able to walk in the finite and the infinite with every step. And yet those two things will never become one. They don't unite. They are incommensurate, and yet you live them. And yet you live them.